The moment Rebecca Ackers stepped into the makeshift auction yard behind Millfield's grain elevator, she felt something was terribly wrong. The autumn wind carried the sharp scent of dying leaves, but underneath it lingered something heavier, something that made the back of her neck prickle. She had been to countless estate sales over the years, but never one that stirred a pit of dread before she even saw the animals. She checked her watch. It was 2:30 p.m., almost time for the livestock portion. She had driven 3 hours from Cedar Valley, not because she needed more horses, but because the newspaper listing had bothered her. 3 registered quarter horses, no details, no bloodlines, no ages. That was never a good sign. Rebecca walked past clusters of buyers examining farm equipment and old tools and made her way toward the holding pens behind the grain elevator. She expected at least a respectable setup, maybe decent fencing or a shaded area. What she found made her breath catch in her chest. 3 horses stood behind flimsy, portable panels that looked too weak to hold goats, let alone full-grown horses. The ground was muddy and cold. The water buckets were bone dry. The wind blew straight through the open space, cutting across animals that had clearly been suffering far longer than a single day. The first horse, a bay stallion, should have been impressive. He was built for strength and speed, the kind of horse-quarter horse breeders spoke about with pride. But he was nothing more than a skeleton wrapped in dull hide. His ribs showed sharply, his hip bones jutted out, and the proud arch of his neck had collapsed into a thin curve of weakness. Fresh scrapes marked his legs. He had likely fought the panels out of fear and hunger. The mare beside him was sorrel with white markings that might once have been striking. Now her head hung low, her knees trembling under her. Her coat was matted with mud and filth, and her eyes looked like empty windows. Rebecca had seen neglected animals before, but the hopelessness in this mare's eyes hit her hard. But it was the third horse, the young gelding, that struck her like a punch to the chest. He lay flat on his side in the mud, breath coming in quick, shallow pulls. He was far too young to look so defeated. His build suggested excellent breeding, but his body told the story of starvation, dehydration, and cruelty. Rebecca turned to an auction worker nearby. "How long have these horses been like this?" Quote. The man didn't even look up from what he was doing. "Since yesterday morning. Boss says they came from some fancy ranch that went bust." "Yesterday morning?" Rebecca's voice sharpened. "They've had no food or water?" "Lady, I move animals, not feed 'em. You want answers? Talk to Thomas." Rebecca found the auctioneer Thomas Polk near the podium. She had known him for years. He was the kind of man who always tried to do things right, but when she asked what happened, his face tightened. "They're estate property, Rebecca," he said. "The heir gave strict instructions. I'm handling the sale legally." "They're starving," Rebecca said, her voice low. "Since when does legal mean acceptable?" Thomas's gaze dropped. She saw the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't proud of this, but he was following orders. Orders from a nephew who wanted the land cleared, the debts settled, and the past erased. The Weatherby Ranch had once been the pride of Millfield County. For decades, Henrik Weatherby had built one of the finest quarter-horse programs in 3 states, but now it was gone, reduced to 3 nearly dead horses and a rushed sale. Rebecca looked at the gathering crowd. Local horse people stood quietly, disturbed by the condition of the animals. But there were strangers here, too. Men in cheap suits, whispering to each other, glancing often at the weak horses. Their cold eyes told her everything she needed to know. They weren't here for breeding stock. They were here for profit, the kind that didn't care whether a horse lived or died. When the bidding began, Thomas announced, Lot 47. 3 registered quarter horses, selling as a group. Rebecca stared at the starving animals and felt heat rise in her chest. Selling as a group meant anyone who wanted just one would be outbid by someone who wanted all 3 for the wrong reasons. "Opening at 500, Thomas called. One of the strangers raised his hand. 600. Rebecca didn't hesitate. 700. The thin man in the cheap suit turned to look at her. His gaze was cold and calculating. Rebecca felt anger knot in her stomach. 800, he said. 900. 1,000. The crowd was silent now, watching the exchange. Rebecca kept raising her hand, matching every bid. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The stallion struggled to stay upright. The mare swayed. The young gelding didn't move at all. When the bidding reached $2, 500, the thin man narrowed his eyes. This was more than he wanted to pay, but he wasn't giving up easily. Rebecca's chest tightened. She had only $3,000 to spare, money meant for ranch repairs. Not a desperate rescue, but when she looked at the gelding lying in the mud, she knew there was only one choice. 3,000, she said, standing tall. The thin man paused, calculating his losses. Then he shook his head. Sold, Thomas declared. Rebecca lifted her chin, voice steady and clear. I'll take them all. The crowd whispered. Many thought she'd ruined herself financially, but Rebecca didn't hear them. She walked straight toward the pen. The 3 horses had found their rescuer, and she knew this was only the beginning. The moment the gavel fell, Rebecca hurried toward the holding pens, her boots splashing through the cold mud. Winning the bid had been stressful enough, but getting 3 starving horses safely loaded was an entirely different challenge. The bay stallion lifted his head as she approached, his dark eyes sharp with fear and the last scraps of pride he still carried. When she slipped the halter over his head, he resisted with a weak surge of strength, but Rebecca steadied him with a firm hand along his neck. It's all right, boy, she murmured softly. You're safe now. He stopped fighting, too exhausted to hold on to anything but instinct. The mare followed more easily. She walked like every step cost her something. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold air, and her sides trembled under her matted coat. Rebecca guided her gently up the ramp and into the trailer, speaking in a low, calm tone the whole time. But the gelding, he was the real test. 2 men Rebecca recognized from other ranch sales offered to help. The gelding lay on his side, legs drawn tight, body shaking with effort. When the men tried to lift him, he lurched weakly, but his legs wouldn't hold his weight. Rebecca knelt beside him, feeling the sharp bones beneath his skin. Come on, sweetheart, she whispered. Just stand long enough to get you home. With careful coordination, the 3 of them managed to get him upright. His legs trembled violently, and his head lolled against Rebecca's shoulder. She didn't let go. They half-walked, half-supported him toward the trailer. Each step felt like a countdown against time. When at last he reached the ramp, he nearly collapsed, but they steadied him and guided him inside. The moment he was secured, Rebecca stepped back, breath trembling with relief. Dr. Beverly Knox arrived just then, her truck pulling in behind Rebecca's. She climbed into the trailer, movements steady and practiced, and began examining each horse. Her expression darkened with every passing minute. How bad? Rebecca asked, waiting for the truth she already feared. Bad enough that we're not sure all 3 will make it through the night, Dr. Knox said. The gelding is in crisis. Severe dehydration, organ strain. The mare is dangerously weak. The stallion is barely holding on through pure willpower. Rebecca swallowed hard. Can they be saved? Maybe, but it will take constant care and a lot of money. I'll do everything I can, but you need to prepare for long nights. I'm prepared, Rebecca said without hesitation. They began the 3-hour drive back to Cedar Valley. Rebecca checked her mirrors constantly, watching the horses shift slowly in the dim trailer light. Every movement felt like a fragile promise that they were still fighting. Dr. Knox followed in her truck, ready to stop and render emergency aid if necessary. When they reached Rebecca's ranch, the sun had gone down, leaving the land washed in pale moonlight. Her barn glowed warmly against the darkness, a stark contrast to the cold misery the horses had come from. She and Dr. Knox moved quickly, settling each animal into thick bedding, with water and small amounts of hay placed within easy reach. Dr. Knox began IV fluids immediately for all 3. The gelding, whose papers later revealed the name Weatherby's Last Chance, barely reacted as the needle slid beneath his skin. His eyes flickered open, dim and distant, as if the world no longer held anything for him. Rebecca stroked his neck gently. You're home now, last chance. You fight, and I'll fight with you." Beside them, the mare, Desert Rose, took a few weak bites of hay, her first in days. She lifted her head slightly when Rebecca touched her shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was hope. The stallion, King's Gold Rush, stood more alert than before. His ears flicked forward when Rebecca entered his stall, and for the first time she saw a faint spark of the noble horse he had once been. They worked through the night, feeding in careful amounts, administering medications, wiping mud and filth from their coats so infections wouldn't set in. The barn lights glowed until dawn, and Rebecca didn't sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. Just after sunrise, Last Chance lifted his head and drank water on his own. Rebecca nearly cried with relief. Desert Rose managed to finish a handful of hay. King's Gold Rush shifted his weight with more strength, watching her with brightening eyes. "They might make it," Dr. Knox said, exhausted but hopeful, "but the next few days will tell us everything." Word spread through Cedar Valley by midday. Some neighbors praised Rebecca for her courage. Others whispered that she was foolish, throwing money away on dying horses. Rebecca ignored the talk. She cared only for the 3 lives inside her barn. But the real test of her resolve came on the 3rd day. A rental car pulled into her driveway. Rebecca found a man standing outside the barn, a man dressed more for an office than a ranch. Douglas Weatherby, Henrik's nephew. "You're the woman who bought my uncle's horses," he said. "I am." Douglas didn't take her offered hand. His eyes darted to the stalls behind her, where the horses rested. "I want to make you an offer," he said. "I'll refund what you paid, plus another 1,000. Rebecca stiffened. "Why?" "Because I learned something about the other bidders at the auction," he said, shifting uneasily. "Things I didn't know before, things I regret." His meaning was clear. Those men weren't there for horses. They were there for a cruel business no one spoke about openly. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "They're not for sale." Douglas looked frustrated. "You could turn a profit. Walk away whole." "No," Rebecca said firmly. "They stay with me." Her words left no room for debate. One by one, the horses behind her were choosing life again, and she wasn't letting them go. 3 months passed, like the turning of a long, hard season, and every day brought another small miracle inside Rebecca's barn. Weatherby's Last Chance, the young gelding who had been too weak to stand without help, now trotted eagerly across the paddock each morning. His coat had taken on a healthy shine, and his eyes, once dull and fading, now sparkled with life. Desert Rose, the mare who had stood with her head hung low in defeat, had regained both her strength and her beauty. She now lifted her ears at the sound of Rebecca's voice and nudged her pockets for treats. King's Gold Rush, the proud stallion, transformed most of all. He carried himself with the noble presence that had once made his bloodlines famous. Every time he stepped into the sunlight, he looked like a piece of living history brought back from the edge of disappearance. The bills had been staggering. Nearly $8,000 in medication, treatments, and follow-up exams. Rebecca had taken out a loan against her ranch, just to keep up. Some nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. But every morning, when she walked into the barn and heard 3 soft nickers greeting her, she knew she would do it all again. Then came the letter. A thick envelope from the American Quarter Horse Association arrived one cool afternoon. Rebecca opened it with mild curiosity, but as she read the documents inside, her breath caught. Henrik Weatherby had kept meticulous breeding records for more than 40 years. Those records showed that all 3 horses carried rare, valuable bloodlines, lines breeders across the country still sought. King's Gold Rush descended from 2 generations of champions. Desert Rose carried the legacy of foundation mares who had produced world-class competitors. Last Chance, despite his youth, held a genetic combination that made trainers take notice. "You could sell any one of them for 10 times what you paid," her neighbor Tom Wilson said when she showed him the papers. "You could wipe out your loan overnight." Quote. Rebecca folded the papers carefully and looked out at the paddock where Last Chance ran in wide, joyful circles. "They're not for sale," she said softly. A year later, Rebecca found herself standing in the very same auction yard where she had saved 3 dying horses. But this time, the world looked different. She wasn't a desperate bidder fighting to keep animals out of cruel hands. She was a respected breeder with a colt to sell, a magnificent young horse, sired by King's Gold Rush and out of Desert Rose. Word had spread across the Southwest. Buyers traveled from neighboring states to see the colt. When the bidding began, it soared higher than Rebecca imagined possible. The final price was enough to pay off her entire loan and still leave her with a new breeding fund. Last Chance had grown into everything his papers promised. Agile, intelligent, and quick-thinking, he had the makings of a champion-cutting horse. Trainers wanted him. Buyers wanted him even more. But Rebecca kept him, not for money, but because he was the heart of her ranch now. As she watched the colt sell, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Mrs. Ackers!" She turned and saw Douglas Weatherby, but he looked nothing like the uneasy outsider who had once offered to buy back the horses. His hands were roughened by work now. His clothes were suited for the dust and wind, not an office. He held himself differently, too, with a quiet steadiness she hadn't seen before. "You're back," Rebecca said. "I bought a small place 50 miles from here," Douglas replied. "Enough land for a few horses. Thought it was time I learned what my uncle was trying to teach me. Took me long enough." Rebecca studied him for a moment. "Learning anything so far?" "Every day," he said with a faint smile. "Mostly that I had no idea what I threw away when I rushed to liquidate his ranch. I heard about Desert Rose's colt. And Last Chance. And the stallion's reputation coming back." He paused, watching Last Chance trot across the warm-up arena. "I also heard you turned down some big offers." "Some things aren't for sale," Rebecca said. "That's what Uncle Henrik used to say." "I'm finally starting to understand." Douglas shifted his hat, looking almost shy. "I wanted to apologize. I handled everything wrong. I saw those horses as property. You saw them as lives. If you hadn't stepped in that day," he swallowed hard, "it would have been unforgivable." "They survived," Rebecca said simply. "That's what matters. They survived because of you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood watching the auction, watching the legacy of Henrik Weatherby live on, not through land or buildings, but through the horses he had cherished. 5 years later, Rebecca's ranch had become a name people respected across the quarter-horse world. Desert Rose and King's Gold Rush produced champions in cutting competitions across the Southwest. Last Chance became the foundation of her training program, teaching young riders and inspiring them with his courage. Developers had built houses where Weatherby Ranch once stood. They named the streets Quarter Horse Lane and Champion Circle, trying to make the land sound noble. But the real legacy lived at Rebecca's ranch, alive, thriving, and running on open pastures. Douglas became a regular visitor. He brought mares for breeding, sought Rebecca's advice, and worked hard to honor the uncle he had once misunderstood. The transformation had taken years, but he had found the connection Henrik tried to leave him, the understanding that horses were not property, they were partners, and caring for them was a responsibility, not a transaction. Rebecca often thought back to that autumn day when she stood at the auction and declared, "I'll take them all." At the time, people whispered she had ruined herself. But now she understood something deeper. Some choices aren't made with logic. They're made with heart. And sometimes, the heart is right. Those 3 starving horses gave her more than financial reward. They gave her a purpose, a legacy, and a future she never expected. And in the end, that was worth more than any price.